Working with a sacred landscape. What do I mean by a sacred landscape? To some degree, I'm going to be talking tonight about literal landscapes, about literal topography, but mostly what I'm going to be talking about is the inner world, however one chooses to think of that, an interaction between the human psyche, individual human psyches, and the psyches of people assembled in groups or communities, and what I'm going to refer to a lot as the numinous, which is essentially the great unknowable other, um, the awe-inspiring dimension of the universe, if you will. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along. To a large degree, what I'm going to be talking about tonight is working with myth, and working with myth in essentially two ways. One is working with established myths, with the myths that have been bequeathed to us from people in the past, some of which still being used and elaborated on and still current, if you will. Others, as I say, bequeathed to us more in manuscripts and so forth. But I'm also going to be talking, and this is really the thrust of tonight's discussion, about building personal myth, about creating a dynamic and lively, vital sense of the numinous, to use that word again, and even provide some thoughts about how one does that in a group setting, what the value of that might be. What do I mean when I say myth? There's a lot of definitions out there. I don't pretend to have a definitive one. To me, myth is a dynamic interaction between culture and what I'm referring to as the numinous, as this unknowable other, the mystery in the universe. What some might choose to call the divine, some might choose to think of as God with the capital G. But there is a sense in human beings, and I touched on it in a previous talk when I was talking about some of Jean-Paul Sartre's ideas, that human beings have a sense, seem to be ingrained with a sense of other, of lacking in perfection, for example, that perfection is possible and that human beings don't possess it. They perceive that they fall short of some hypothetical mark. And so it's that sort of anxiety, that sense of awe that it derives from this awareness of things like infinity, of death, of finality, and the unknowable quality of these things, that generates the need to understand and encapsulate them, and it seems that in turn provides us with the raw material for myth. It's fashionable, following people like Carl Jung and probably more popularly Joe Campbell, to think of myth as somehow the dreams of the collective unconscious of a culture. That as the dream is to the individual, symbolic messages from the depths of the personal unconscious, that collectives, that cultures, the communities start to formulate myth out of their shared unconscious symbol making, their experience of symbols as a community, as a collective, and that those find their way into, they find expression in the form of myths, stories, narratives. What I want to focus on, though, is the idea that myths embody a certain kind of truth. This is another concept that people like Joseph Campbell tend to touch on when they talk about things like the power of myth. But truth is a much misunderstood word. And I think in Western culture we tend to confuse truth, the word truth, with the word fact. And I think I've touched on this previously in this series as well, that there is a tendency sometimes when you start talking about truth to assume that it's referring to an objective fact, something that can be verified in the material world, an assertion about the sensory world, the material world that can be verified. And so when we say of an assertion in, say, religious dogma that it is true, we sometimes fail to understand that the word true can have multiple meanings. And that to say 2 plus 2 equals 4 asserts a truth of mathematics, or to say that the Christian God, the Abrahamic God, created the world in 7 days is true, are not necessarily saying exactly the same thing, and yet people will often fail to manage to hold on to that distinction. And so the latter assertion about the creation of the universe can be thought of in a reflexive, knee-jerk way as being the same kind of fact as 2 plus 2 equals 4 is in mathematics. What I'm going to suggest is that it's important to avoid the trap of regarding a mythic truth, which is to say a symbolic representation of reality rather than a literal materialistic representation of reality. Or another way to look at it is a poetic or metaphoric representation of reality. It's good to hold on to and be aware of that distinction between that kind of truth, the truth of myth, versus fact. To some degree, what I'm suggesting here, and some things I'm going to say that follow, is that it's difficult for human beings to hang on to what seem to be opposites, but that it's important to work on doing so. That one of the problems we have in Western society is that we tend to fall into dualistic thinking. We tend to assume that things are either or. My favorite example is from presidential rhetoric. You're either with us or you're with the terrorists. There's no room for middle ground. The world has to be looked at in black and white, and ergo a word like truth can only have one meaning. And so if a myth is true, it must be true in the same sense that a fact in science or mathematics is true. In Irish mythology, or at least in the folk traditions in Ireland, there are 2 centers to the land. Uisneach is one and Tara is the other. They're not terribly far apart, but they're not a stone's throw apart either. They're a healthy drive apart. They're in 2 different counties, County Westmeath and County Meath. In the mythic narratives, each of these centers, each of these hills, and they're literal hills, embodies a certain kind of centrality. It embodies a kind of a unifying principle of the land, and those unifying principles are not identical. In other words, the quality of Uisneach as center is slightly different from the quality of Tara as center, and hopefully we'll have a chance to come back to that. But they're both centers. Now, how can you have 2 centers of one island? Well, if you look at it in the narrow, sort of dualistic, materialistic sense, you can't. You sort of have to pick one or the other. And you could, I suppose, do an analysis of the map of Ireland and an atlas and determine exactly where the center of the geographic extent of Ireland really is, and call that the center. And really, Uisneach is relatively close to where that point would be. So it's a pretty good candidate for center. But what's being talked about with Uisneach as the center, as one unifying point of the island of Ireland, is not really an assertion about where it is as a geographic center, but again, as a unifying point, as embodying a concept, an idea of center, rather than the literal, materialistic view of the precise point that is the geographic center of the island of Ireland. We're talking a symbolic, a metaphoric, a mythic, a poetic center. So Uisneach represents, and I'll elaborate on this in a second, Uisneach as one center embodies one metaphor, It's one view of one perspective on what the land is and what the center should do, how it should function. Terra is another perspective. It is another metaphor for center. It stands in a slightly different relationship to the land, and how it holds center, as we sometimes talk about a priest or priestess in ritual doing. How Terra holds center is slightly different than Ushnik. Both of these places, it's said, are the center of 5/5 of Ireland. Coiched, C-O-I-C-E-D, is the Old Irish word that's equivalent to province, and it means a fifth. Now these days, there are 4 provinces in Ireland: Leinster, Munster, Connacht, and Ulster. In the manuscripts that refer to Uisneach and Tara as centers of Ireland, there were 5. In Uisneach, these 5/5, these 5 provinces, radiate from Uisneach as a center point. They're like slices in a pizza pie, sliced in the traditional way. They all come together, in a sense, with their points touching the hill of Uisneach. And on that hill there is a stone, popularly called the Cat Stone, also known as the Stone of Divisions, that is supposedly the point where all 5 provinces of Ireland come together. And in a certain sense, that stone is meant to embody, in some way, something of those 5 provinces. In this view of Ireland, of its sacred geography, its mythic landscape, there are 2 Munsters, giving us 5 provinces: Leinster, Connacht, Ulster, and 2 Munsters. And Uisneach is the uniting point. It has associations with magic and druidry. The first ritual fire was said to have been lit there and to have burned for 7 years on the hilltop at Uisneach. Tara, on the other hand, is first of all known as the seat of the Irish High Kings. So if Uisneach is associated with ritual, with the lighting of the first seasonal ritual fire, first druidic fire, if you will, Tara is better known for being the political center of Ireland. And there are a number of myths, which I'll come back to in a little bit, of how Tara was set up, how, for example, the banqueting hall at Tara was laid out, that suggest a very orderly arrangement of provinces in this kind of concentric circle, or a board game sort of a layout, with the seat of the High King at the central hearth of the High King, and his banqueting hall being essentially at the very center of the land. Tara is also seen as being at the center of 5 provinces, of the 5/5 of Ireland. In this case, ringing around it are the 4 well-known contemporary extant provinces of Ireland that I've already mentioned: Leinster, Munster, Connacht, and Ulster. And the 5th province in this case is in the center. So there are 5 quarters, in a sense, around the outside, a sort of outer ring, with County Meath, then the province of Meath, at the center, with Tara at the center of Meath. And so here we have a sort of perspective or metaphor for center and for how the land is arranged and how its pieces fit together into one unified whole, that depends on the king being at the very center, being the unifying element for all of the land. And it's whereas the Uisneach model was something of a pizza sliced into slices. In this case, we're talking more about something akin to concentric circles, or defensive battlements around this important center point. So the provinces are arrayed around Meath, and within Meath at the center is Tara. And then within Tara there's the banqueting hall of the king. And within that structure, within that sort of inner order, there are places for the provincial kings arrayed around the high king in the center. So again, a sort of image akin to concentric circles, focusing in towards the high king, who is seen as the uniting principle for all of the land, which harkens back to what I spoke about in talking about the land and the people, and the king as the fit representative of all the people. So there's two pictures of the center of a land, neither of which refer to the literal geographic center of the land, but both provide a way of looking at the land and a way of understanding what unites the land, what unites the disparate pieces of the land, the disparate regions of the land into one unified whole. Now that unified whole doesn't really exist. I mean, Ireland is like any other nation. It's a collection of people with their own hopes and aspirations and conflicts, living in various villages and cities and smaller settlements in mountainous or boggy or rolling plains, all sorts of different landscapes. So what we're really talking about here is what I'm referring to as a sacred landscape when we look at the Ireland of myth and how it's defined by things like these two views of the center at Ishnik and the center of Tara. They're metaphoric views of the land. They speak to a kind of archetypal view of the land, if you will. The land as a sort of a perfectible whole, something to aspire to, a way of understanding the land that is simpler and more direct than trying to contend as an individual human being with all of the messy conflicts and imperfections of the land. And that's ultimately, I think, in many ways what myth does. It tries to distill human experience down into more comprehensible narrative. I think as individuals, as contemporary pagans, we can do the same thing. We can undertake that process ourselves. And the traditional myths, the myths that have been bequeathed to us from the past, are excellent raw material for that. And I think that's in many ways what most, if not all, modern pagans do. Work with what appears to be surviving sort of the spiritual counsel of previous generations, if you will, or the spiritual wisdom, and where it does survive, the spiritual practices of our forebears, and to try to recast that into terms that are relevant for us as contemporary human beings. And so when I talk about working with a sacred landscape, I'm talking about one aspect of this, and that is starting to move beyond the external and to start to flesh out this milieu in the inner plane. That as one finds attraction to, is stimulated by images, mythic narratives, poetry, songs and chants, any of that, that as that starts to flesh out the spiritual world on the material level, it's possible to build a mythic landscape out of that raw material. Now, I'm going to ultimately end tonight, when we get to the end, with a guided visualization that's built on some images from Irish mythology. And I'm not going to sort of play tour guide and explain what each image or what each place along the journey is or where it's drawn from. But they are all drawn from bits and pieces of ancient Irish mythology. And that's really the point of everything I'm trying to say tonight, which is that one doesn't have to literally understand the content of myth. One doesn't need to literally understand the content of myth to be moved by it, to work with it, to flesh out one's physical altar in one's home, much less to flesh out how one creates a home in one's spiritual inner world for the gods and goddesses, for the ancestors, for other spirits. And the more one builds a welcoming and three-dimensional home in the inner plane, the more welcome those beings are. And this work can be done in groups. In fact, it's often the primary work to be done by contemporary pagans, because there isn't an unbroken tradition of images and liturgy and so forth, of custom. The images and the liturgies, the customs have to be built. And if they're going to be meaningful to the group to some degree has to participate in the building, or at least the selection of images and the selection of raw material that's employed should be as meaningful to as many people as possible. I'm going to shift gears for just a second and come back to the physical land as raw material, since I'm talking a little bit about raw material for inner work. And since I said I'm going to come back to at the end of this a guided visualization that uses specifically Irish material. I'm only focusing on Ireland for two reasons. One, I guess three reasons actually. One is it's mythic material that I'm well familiar with personally, so it's sort of close at hand for me to work from. Two, it's possible to conceive of Ireland as a sort of sacred vessel of itself. This is something I've touched on in a previous talk, that Ireland was outside the Roman Empire, so it has its own insular culture of a sort. It's not that it wasn't ever visited by Romans or anyone else from the Mediterranean, far from that. But it maintained its own unique culture, somewhat longer than many other places, even on the fringe of Europe. And adding to that, there's the fact that it is an island, that it's bounded on all sides by the sea. And so when we think of things like these 5/5, you can easily visualize the entire island and visualize it perhaps as divided up into 5 distinct realms that have 5 different characteristics, or dominant characteristics. Ireland also is interesting because it has a rich history of place name myths. There is a body of place name mythology called the Dintenicus. Some of the etymologies of place names, there are probably many of the etymologies of place names that are found in that, are probably spurious. They're probably folk etymologies that were invented by people in the Middle Ages to explain how places got their names, because the name sounded like the name of a god. And so places got associated, perhaps, in tracts like this, with the god, that so-and-so did such and such an exploit there, and that's why it has this name. But regardless of why these place name myths exist, they do exist. And so in a certain sense, it seems to me, the land and a lot of the places in it have been made sacred. They've been mythologized. If one over the years sort of explores these bits and pieces of mythology that have attached themselves to the land, you really get a sense of a sacred geography, of a sacred landscape, to use the phrase that I'm employing in the title of the talk. So you can actually use images from the land, or visit the land of Ireland, for example. You do this with other places, of course, to flesh out the inner landscape that you build for yourself. One can visit the Hill of Tara, for example. Now, you might get there and find that it doesn't conform to what you might expect if you've only been reading the myths. But there are things about it that you can pick out, even from photographs, and use to help in visualization to start to make this inner landscape, the sacred landscape, specific. One of the things that I find sort of interesting is there is the so-called leofoil, which is the stone, the coronation stone, I should say the inauguration stone. It's the stone on which supposedly a prospective king would stand, and the stone would cry out if it was the true king that was standing on it. Now, the leofoil on the Hill of Tara is essentially a stone phallus. It's a very short stone obelisk, if you will. It would be awfully hard to stand on. Wouldn't even be terribly comfortable to sit on. So this is another example of the tension between the literal and the mythic. And so, do you use the literal stone in imagining this right of kingship, if one were wanting to work with that for whatever reason? And the answer is, I don't know. But that's, an example of the raw material that's out there to work with or not to work with. And to remember that just as Uisneach or Tara are not literally the geographic center of Ireland, they're metaphoric centers, they're mythic centers. So too, this real stone might provide some inspiration for how you visualize the stone, or it might not, because it's only the literal stone. It isn't necessarily the mythic stone. The mythic stone can be what you want it to be. It can look as much like the literal stone as you wish, and is as helpful. To narrow this down even a little bit more specifically, and talk just a little bit more about Tara. It is, as I said, the seat of kings in traditional Ireland, in the mythic Ireland. Geographically, it's really in the east. It's pretty darn close to the eastern coast of Ireland. Mythically, though, as I say, it's in the center. And so it demands of us, first of all, when we think about Tara, that we have to release from a literal attitude about what things are. And I will say, somewhat parenthetically, that this is a real challenge for a lot of people who I've encountered who are working in a reconstructionist pagan vein, who are trying to work from scraps of mythology and scraps of archaeology and scraps of description of liturgy, of ritual, to try to rebuild and reclaim what the ancient pagan, say Irish in this case, religion might have been like. And the problem is that most of the material we have is not really meant to be taken literally. It's myth. This takes us right back to where I started this. That what a myth is saying is not a literal, empirical fact. It's a way of looking at things. It's an attitude towards things. So Tara can be seen, as with the stone that I was talking about a moment ago, as the literal place that it is, or one can release that and understand Tara as being what it needs to be to serve myth, to serve as the center of the order, the social order. Tara also is in a kind of tension, again metaphorically, mythically, with Uisneach. Tara was where the ritual fire at Samhain, supposedly the new year, was lit, whereas the ritual fire that was lit at Uisneach supposedly was at Beltane, the beginning of the summer. So there they stand, these two centers of the land, with ritual fires being lit at the two great hinge points of the year. There are suggestions that all the hearth fires in the land were rekindled from the flames of these great ritual fires. Again, is that literally true? Maybe, maybe not. Much ink has been spilled about that. I've seen suggestions that what happened was that when the fire was lit on these important hills, people on other hills were watching, and they would then light their fire in turn. Then that would signal people further away to light their fires, and then from there, people would light their hearth fires, and once again, the hearth fires would be lit throughout the land. In a sense, kindled by the fire at Tara or the fire at Ishnek. Then again, maybe none of that happened. And maybe this is just a way of looking at the land as united, as the people being caught in a web of interconnection. And that specifically that web of interconnection is linked inextricably to the passage of the year, to the great festivals that were dedicated to honoring the gods and goddesses. That the prosperity of the hearth, that the life-giving fire that had to be maintained in the hearth within the home is inextricably linked to the practice of lighting these great seasonal ritual fires. And then again, maybe it was literal. Maybe people took fire from these great ritual fires and passed them around the land and lit every single hearth in turn. We won't ever know. And everybody is free to use that image as best they see fit. Tara and Ishnek also embody a sort of tension between sacred order, the order of settled human culture, and the primal land before the people. The fire at Ishnek was lit by a great druid of a people that were in the land of Ireland before the Gaelic peoples, before the so-called Milesians came. One of the first settlers in primal times, long before history really began, lit this fire that burned for many years. And so Ishnek embodies this kind of founding primal quality, whereas Tara represents the order governed by the High King. And more specifically, we should say, by the High Kings, one after the other. Each of them standing at the sort of pinnacle of Irish society. Now, in reality, again, to look at the literal level rather than the mythic or folkloric level, Ireland wasn't never really that united. The notion of a high king who maintained order over all of Ireland is fiction, to say the very least. So why does the idea exist? Because, as I've suggested before, it represents an aspiration. It represents the perfectibility of order. It represents what people aspire to. And this is what people do in ritual. They aspire to touch perfection, to touch the divine, to touch, to use the word I haven't used in a little bit, the numinous, the great mystery, the things that people so fall short of, but never stop aspiring to, never stop hoping to understand. The visualization that I'm going to do in just a little bit here is built partly on this sort of sacred geography of Tara. There is a tract, manuscript tract called The Settling of the Manor at Tara. I've actually referred to it in a previous talk. It is specifically the tract that lists the various characteristics associated with the 5/5 of Ireland: Leinster and Munster and Connacht and Ulster and Meath in the centre, representing kingship. In that tract, as well as in some others, including another tale called Bricrew's Feast, which describes, in general terms, the layout of the banqueting hall of Tara. From these manuscript pieces, we get this image of Tara as having the seat of the king in the center, defended in a sense by other thrones for the regional kings, and then presumably the literal land of those regions extending outward from there. There are images related to a board game called Branov, where again the king, the piece that represents the king, is at the center, and then 4 other pieces are around it that would represent the 4 provincial kings, reinforcing this image of things radiating out from the center, but also the center being, in a sense, defended. That getting to the center, to really stand at the center, one has to be king, literally. And to get to that, one has to become the sort of unblemished, fit representative of the people that the king was meant to be. So passing through to ultimately stand literally at the center, one has to go through the passage, go through the life journey that the king would have had to go through to become king. Because as I suggested in my talk on the land and the people, the king, at least in the Gaelic cultures, was not king by hereditary right, and certainly not by divine right, as so many of us are accustomed to thinking in English-derived culture these days. The king had to be meritorious. The king was there because the king had been proven worthy. We're going to go on a bit of a journey through a sacred landscape. For the guided visualization that follows, you should have a lit candle before you. You may wish to pause the recording at this time in order to set up and light a candle for that purpose. See the flame before you. Establish it in your mind's eye. Close your eyes, holding the flame there, alone, in your vision eye. You are floating with this light before you in the sea, floating. The depths around you, the light before you. Focus on the flame as it resolves itself into a roaring fire before you in the dark. The fire throwing sparks up into the dark sky. You move through the waters towards the fire, and you see the shore. Step out of the sea, out of the waters, and onto the shore by the light of the fire. Feel its warmth, its energy. Out of the darkness, on the shore, from around the fire, comes a woman. She leads you to a dome-shaped rock. Stand before the rock and take it in. You begin to move about it and explore it. Circle it 3 times. Focus on the rock as you circle it thrice. As you complete your 3rd circuit, the landscape around you changes. You smell earth, soil, and in the darkness, you see the shape of an earthen mound that extends into the darkness. You work your way along it. It's a circular rampart, circular earthworks. Move around this rampart, this earthen rampart, until you come to another woman, beckoning to you to a place to enter. And when you come to this passage in through the ramparts, through the earthworks, go through whatever passage is there, to come into a hall, moist. Perhaps there's rain driven through this space. wind, people there in the hall. Hear thunder, and as you hear thunder, are there flashes of lightning? Look for the lightning. As lightning flashes, look for the source. The lightning is coming from a spear. Flashes of lightning shoot out like a spear would shoot through the air. Move to the spear, move past the spear. Look for another passage, to another hall, where you hear the sound of music from a harp. Move into another place, filled with music, where there is a large figure of a man bearing a sword, challenges you. You stay as long as he maintains that challenge with the sword, until you know that it is time to move on to another passageway. And here, there's heat. Heat that surrounds you, that holds you. The heat of a fire over which is an enormous pot stirred by an even more enormous, gigantic figure. The heat is not only from the fire that warms the cauldron, it comes from heat within the vessel as well, from a fire within the roiling waters of the cauldron, stirred by the giant figure. You move past the colossal cauldron. Perhaps you're able to see what is inside. You move on to one more passage, into one more chamber that smells even more strongly of earth and livestock, sweat of horses running in the fields. The only object in this chamber, in this place, is a stone. Approach the stone. And touch the stone. Somewhere a door opens, and a voice asks you, what? A question? From where the voice emanates, there is one more passageway with pure white light within. You may enter, or you may not. Are you bidden to enter, or no? Where you find yourself, remain a while. Take in what you've seen along the way. And when you have taken in what you need to take in, find your way back to the fire by the shore, to the fire, the candle where you began.